Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people coming in to the room for today's session with Bonny Cumming. I'm going to introduce Bonny in just a moment, but I will just do a quick introduction. Now, I just closed my window very quickly because I suddenly have some workmen deciding to do work outside the window right as we started. So bear with me. Hopefully it won't interrupt the introduction. Okay, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, which for me is the Larrakia people. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge the profound impact of domestic and family violence on individuals, families, and the wider community in Australia. I support initiatives aimed at preventing domestic and family violence and creating a space where everyone feels safe and supported. Finally, I wish to acknowledge that we all come from different places and have different circumstances. I respect and welcome our collective differences, and I strive to create a space where all voices are heard and valued, and where everyone feels comfortable in engaging and participating. And I hope you'll join me with that today. I do ask that you turn off your microphones while we have Bonny speaking to us today, but if you have an ability to turn on your video, we'd really appreciate it if you could. Please note that today's session will be recorded. For those based in Darwin, on Friday the 21st of August, we will have a breakfast with Yvette Rowe from Charles Darwin University from 9 to 10 Australian Central Standard Time. On Thursday the 3rd of September, we have our next Mind Your Melon training session with Tom from Healthy Minds. Tom will be talking about building workplace connectedness, and the session will run from 11 Australian Central Standard Time, and you are all welcome to attend that. If you are interested in our upcoming events, please check out the What's On page from the AMRRIC website. And if you're not on our email distribution list and you would like to be, please don't hesitate to shoot us an email and we'll sign you up. There will be a survey at the end of today's session. We're really interested in your feedback on these events, so please spend 1 to 2 minutes in providing feedback because it will be really valuable for us. Thank you for joining today's NABS Biosecurity Think Tank. These sessions are designed to be more than just a standard webinar. The purpose is to spark ideas, surface different ways of thinking, and help you to consider how the approaches shared today might be translated into your own context. As we hear from Bonny, I encourage you to focus less on the specifics of her work and more on the underlying ideas and approaches being used. Consider what challenges you might face in your own organisation that these might relate to, what elements could be adapted, and how this thinking might strengthen preparedness or response in your context. Rather than looking for immediate answers during the presentation, I invite you to listen for 1 or 2 or multiple strong ideas that you can take away to reshape your own work. And with that in mind, I leave you with some guiding reflections. Firstly, what is one idea from today that you could adapt? And secondly, what would it look like if you applied it? At the end of today's session, there'll be time to ask Bonny questions as well as to discuss the concepts amongst the group. And I would really invite you to do that either in the chat or by putting your hand up and asking directly. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Bonny. Dr. Bonny Cumming is the Head of Innovation and Strategy at AMRRIC, where she leads research, evaluation and innovation across the organisation's One Health programs. Her work focuses on partnering with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to develop practical, community-centred approaches to animal health and biosecurity. She's particularly interested in how program design influences participation, trust and long-term outcomes. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bonny. It's awesome to have you.
It's my pleasure, Anne. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be here, but to have the opportunity to have these more in-depth thinks with colleagues as well. And it's lovely to see so many familiar names among the participant list too. I'm really happy to be here and I appreciate the opportunity. And I want to explore a principle that AMRRIC uses increasingly across our work, particularly our biosecurity related services. And that's no survey without service. It asks a fundamental question that if we seek information, access and participation from communities, what value, what lasting capability are we prepared to create in partnership with them? I'll use companion animal health and AMRRIC's biosecurity pilot as the main examples, but the questions extend well beyond dogs and cats. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Waka Waka peoples as the traditional custodians of the country which I'm joining you from, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands from which you are all joining us, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of the audience as well. I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and that country encompasses relationships between people, animals, plants, water, culture and knowledge. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, AMRRIC is a national not-for-profit organisation working in partnership with rural and remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations. Our vision is healthy animals, healthy, proud communities. And we deliver animal health services, education and training, and research and advocacy. Although our work focuses strongly on dogs and cats, the outcomes extend well across human health, community wellbeing, country, culture, biodiversity, and biosecurity. In 2024-25, AMRRIC services supported 135 unique remote communities, so our perspectives come from sustained practical work across very different regional contexts. The map here gives a sense of the breadth of our on-ground work. It also reminds us that remote communities are not a single context. Governance, service arrangements, geography, workforce, and animal populations all differ substantially. And the principles that I discussed today, therefore, need to be adapted rather than applied as a copy-paste template. AMRRIC's breadth gives us a useful view across communities, vet services and government systems. But it's important to be clear about the standpoint from which I'm speaking. I'm a non-Indigenous veterinarian, and AMRRIC is not yet an Aboriginal controlled community organisation. Although we work with many communities, we do not speak for those communities or hold the cultural authority to define their priorities. Our role is to support relationships, connect sectors, translate evidence, and advocate from what we have learned through long-term partnerships. We're also working to strengthen Indigenous authority within AMRRIC, including through our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Committee and our transition towards majority Indigenous leadership. So the ideas I offer today are not a definitive Indigenous model for biosecurity, and AMRRIC has certainly not perfectly resolved every question I will raise. They instead reflect what our work has taught us and where our own practice continues to evolve. Biosecurity programs seek surveillance information because it has value. It may help detect a new disease, understand distribution, protect an industry, guide a response, or strengthen national preparedness. But obtaining that information can require communities to contribute knowledge, access, time, labour, relationships, and trust. The benefits generated by the activity may be national, governmental, or sectoral, while the costs and demands of participation can sometimes be heavily experienced locally. So the question is not simply whether communities benefit in some general sense, it's whether value is created with the community according to locally relevant priorities as part of the way the activity is designed. Biosecurity is often represented through technical systems, diagnostics, surveillance platforms, labs, and response plans. But every part of that system depends on people. Someone notices a change, provides access, shares knowledge, undertakes work, and sustains follow-up. In remote settings, the system may rely heavily on relationships and trust that sit outside of formal biosecurity structures. And these aren't soft additions to technical capability. They influence what information becomes available, how quickly it moves, and whether a response can operate in practice. People also carry the practical costs of participation. They make time, arrange transport, interpret between systems, manage community expectations, and remain after visiting teams leave. When programs overlook these contributions, they can underestimate both the true cost of surveillance and the infrastructure on which it depends. Biosecurity depends on people, but different people encounter animal health and biosecurity issues through different roles and relationships. Rangers may notice changes in wildlife or country. Animal owners notice changes in an individual animal's health or behaviour. Local workers may recognise a pattern developing across the community. Visiting veterinary services can investigate clinical signs and support diagnostics, while government agencies bring surveillance systems, risk assessment and response authority. They also bring different priorities. A nationally important surveillance question may not be the most immediate concern for an animal owner, local worker or community organisation. Effective participation therefore depends on understanding what matters to each group and connecting their knowledge, responsibilities and priorities. Australia's most mature animal biosecurity systems have developed around sectors whose economic and trade value is clearly recognised. Organised representation via peak industry bodies supports sustained investment shared between government and industry. And these arrangements build mature surveillance, service and response capability. That investment's understandable completely, but it also shows that capability is produced. It doesn't emerge simply because a risk exists. Where economic or trade value is less visible to government, representation and investment are often weaker, and the system around animals remains less developed. Livestock systems illustrate the cumulative effects of that recognition. Producers have established organisations, routine contact with animal health services, familiar reporting pathways, and clear expectations that unusual disease will trigger investigation. Those arrangements make surveillance visible and repeatable, rather than dependent on individual relationships. Companion animals in remote communities sit differently. Their value to owners and communities is clear, but formal representation is limited. Responsibilities are dispersed, reporting pathways are often relationship dependent, and resourcing is inconsistent. Dogs and cats may fall between local government, environmental health, vet services, public health, and biosecurity. When responsibility is unclear, the practical work can default to whichever local organisation or individual is willing to take it on. This matters because emerging disease doesn't respect administrative gaps. Companion animals can nonetheless be highly relevant to national interests. They move with people, interact with wildlife and livestock, share households and environments, and may act as sentinels or hosts for zoonotic or vector-borne diseases. The gap is therefore not a lack of relevance, but a lack of system architecture proportionate to that relevance. We can think of disease detection as a connected pathway: observation, examination, sampling, diagnosis, reporting, and response. A national system may have excellent laboratory and response plans, but those capabilities only matter if the earlier links function. An animal must first be noticed, assessed, and examined. An appropriate sample must be collected and transported, and someone must know how and where to report the concern. Each stage has different workforce, service, and relationship requirements. The pathway is also recursive rather than purely linear. A response may require further observation, sampling, or owner engagement, while an inconclusive result may depend on someone locally monitoring animals over time. And that's why continuity between visiting expertise and local capability is so important. In many remote communities, none of those steps can simply be taken for granted. Vet services may only visit intermittently. Local workers may be responsible for several unrelated portfolios and have competing priorities. Diagnostic freight can be costly or difficult to arrange, and the organisation encountering the problem may not know which agency holds responsibility. The issue, therefore, is not merely whether Australia has sophisticated diagnostic and response capabilities somewhere within the system, but it's whether there's reliable pathways connecting an animal in a remote community to that capability. If one or more links are absent, an apparently sound preparedness framework may not translate into a functional operational response. The emergence of Ehrlichia canis in 2020 provided a real-world test of those assumptions. E. canis is a bacterial disease transmitted by the brown dog tick. And once introduced into Northern Australia, it encountered an environment highly conducive to establishment and spread. A widespread and effective vector in the brown dog tick, warm climatic conditions, which the brown dog tick loves, and dog populations with substantial movement within and between communities. But the biological conditions were only part of the story. The disease also encountered and entered communities where veterinary access was often intermittent. Local animal health workforces are limited. Local, dogs and cats frequently carried significant existing burdens of ticks, parasites, and other illnesses. Early clinical signs could therefore be difficult to distinguish from what had become a familiar baseline of poor animal health. The response pathway was also much less established than what it would have been for a major livestock disease. Responsibility for companion animal disease control was dispersed, routine surveillance was limited, and many communities did not have continuous access to the people, equipment, and services needed to examine animals, collect samples, and support sustained follow-up. Government agencies, veterinarians, community organisations, and local workers all contributed to the response. But the outbreak exposed how heavily effective action depends on assembling those relationships and capabilities after the disease had arrived. So eCountis didn't simply test whether Australia could identify and respond to a new pathogen. It also tested whether national capability could connect with the operational reality of companion animal health in remote communities. And the response to eCountis necessarily focused on the immediate disease control task, understanding its distribution, controlling ticks, providing communities with relevant information. But it quickly became apparent that pathogen-specific activity could only achieve so much when the underlying animal health system remained weak. Surveillance depended on veterinary teams being resourced and able to reach communities, examine dogs and collect samples. Treatment and prevention depended on access to suitable products, repeated follow-up, and people locally who could support implementation. Communication depended on trusted organisations and workers who understood both the disease and the community context. Many of the capabilities needed during the emergency were the same capabilities required for routine animal health. Consistent services, a supported local workforce, established relationships, and clear coordination between organisations. This generated a broader call for systems change. The question was no longer just how do we control eCountis, but also what animal health capability needs to exist before the next disease arrives. And that distinction matters. If preparedness investment begins only after a threat is detected, response teams must try to build access, trust, workforce, and delivery pathways on the fly during the emergency itself. Emergency preparedness is therefore not separate from routine animal health investment. It's built through the capability and relationships maintained between emergencies. Several years later, we now have H5 bird flu, and it's raising a similar concern. This time through a disease whose potential pathways cross wildlife, poultry, public health, companion animals, and communities. Each part of this system has different responsibilities and capabilities, but the disease can move across these boundaries. Remote communities may experience exposure through hunting, wildlife interactions, free roaming animals, or limited access to veterinary assessment. Again, the challenge is whether national expertise can connect with the people, animals, and services operating locally. The appropriate response will not be identical everywhere. However, plans need to recognise that communities actually interact with animals and wildlife, which local organisations already hold trusted relationships, and how advice, testing and follow-up will reach places without continuous animal health technical capability. eCountis and H5 bird flu are biologically very different, but they raise the same systems questions. Can national capability connect with local reality? Detection depends on access. Access depends on services and relationships. Reporting is useful only when it connects to investigation and response. And this is why community engagement cannot sit as a communications activity on the edge of a technical program. It's part of how detection and response capability is made operational. When that connection is weak, National systems may hold sophisticated technical capability, but still struggle to see what's occurring at a local level. Conversely, strong local observation without access to diagnostics and response support may leave important questions unresolved. Preparedness requires that both ends of the system work together. In the next part of this presentation, I want to look more closely at the local operating environment. What shapes disease visibility, participation, and the practical feasibility of surveillance in remote communities. So before an unusual animal disease event can be recognised, it must stand out against the everyday animal health baseline. Where skin disease, parasite burdens, poor body condition, or intermittent illness are already common, a new pattern might be difficult to distinguish. Owners and local workers might be extremely observant, but the signal itself is noisy. Improving routine animal health is therefore relevant to surveillance. It reduces background disease and creates more opportunities for animals to be observed, examined, and discussed. Baseline health also shapes community expectations. If chronic skin disease or poor condition is normalised because of effective services that are rarely available, owners may reasonably wait until illness is severe before seeking help. And that doesn't indicate a lack of care. It instead reflects what the surrounding service system has made possible. Those everyday animal health conditions don't arise in isolation. They're shaped by broader structural and social determinants. Those same conditions influence whether emerging diseases can be detected and acted upon also. These include housing, infrastructure, workforce availability, transport, income, fragmented responsibilities, and the continuing effects of colonisation. Animal health, human health, and service access are shaped by many of these same conditions. I'm sure that many on the call are familiar with the geographic and climatic barriers that are experienced in Northern Australia. Distance, seasonal access, flooding, heat, and the cost of travel then amplify structural barriers. A service that is straightforward in a regional centre may require days of planning and substantial expense in a remote community. The result is limited and intermittent access to animal health services. And that affects routine care, but also whether a potential disease signal can be clinically assessed, sampled, investigated, and followed up. Service availability is therefore part of detection capability. Effective detection requires both supported local roles and accessible vet services. Local workers can provide continuing observation, knowledge of individual animals and their movements, community patterns, trusted relationships with owners, and follow-up between visits. Visiting veterinary teams provide clinical expertise, diagnostics, treatment, and connections to wider response systems. One cannot substitute for the other. Local roles, however, need to be defined, supported, and paid. Visiting services similarly need to be reliable, resourced, and accessible. Most importantly, investment is needed in the connection between them so that observation can move into assessment and action as needed. Supported local capability might sit within ranger teams, environmental health services, local government animal management roles, or other community-controlled organisations. The right arrangement will vary depending on the community, and what matters is that responsibility is explicit, that the work fits within the organisation's mandate, and that workers can access technical advice without carrying clinical responsibilities beyond their role. Noticing something unusual is usually only the first step. A worker then needs to interpret it, document it, know where to report it, and remain involved in the follow-up. Each action requires an enabler, local knowledge, training and advice, practical tools, clear contacts and protocols, and really importantly, organisational backing. This is why training alone doesn't create capability. A trained person without time, authority, equipment, or accessible reporting contacts may still be unable to act. Durable capability sits across the whole pathway, not only with the individual worker. Practical design, therefore, is crucial here. Reporting tools have to work in limited connectivity and field conditions. Contacts must remain current. Uncertainty has to be welcomed rather than penalised, and workers need feedback after escalating a concern. Otherwise, even a technically correct protocol might become unusable in practice. Even when suitable roles and pathways do exist, biosecurity work also competes with other legitimate priorities. Local organisations may already be responsible for housing, environmental health, essential services, community safety, or cultural responsibilities, often with small workforces covering vast areas. Observing animals, recording information, coordinating access and supporting follow-up all require paid time and organisational effort. If this work matters to the national system, local capacity therefore can't be assumed, and instead must be formally recognised, prioritised and resourced. National importance does not automatically create local urgency either. A community organisation might be dealing with unsafe housing, water or waste problems at the same time an external program requests surveillance support. Respectful partnership therefore means recognising those competing demands and negotiating what's feasible, rather than interpreting limited participation as limited interest. Resourcing, of course, makes participation possible, but relationships influence whether information is actually shared. Trust grows when organisations listen, respond, follow through and return. It affects whether owners describe what they've noticed, provide access to animals and places, act on advice and report another concern later. Local workers hold their own relationships and accountability within communities. And it's really important that these relationships are acknowledged and respected, not treated as convenient access pathways. A system that appears only when it needs information may remain largely blind. A system connected through useful and consistent relationships is more likely to hear about change early on. Trust is also affected by what happens after reporting. If people provide access, describe a concern, or assist with sampling and then hear nothing, the interaction teaches them that reporting creates lots of work but little value. Closing that feedback loop is therefore both an ethical responsibility and a practical investment in future surveillance. Surveillance asks people to contribute knowledge, time, access, and sometimes sensitive information. If that information leaves the community and produces no useful feedback, service, or local action, participation becomes extractive. Reciprocal participation works differently. Priorities are negotiated, benefits are visible, information supports local action, and capability and relationships remain after the project. So it's not about offering an inducement for data. It's about recognising that sustainable participation depends on value moving both ways. Extraction can often occur when can even occur where engagement is friendly and consent is completed. If questions, methods and data use remain externally controlled though, local labour is inadequately recognised or results never return in a useful form, the underlying exchange is still one way. Reciprocity therefore needs to be visible in the allocation of influence, resources and benefits. So this section that I've been speaking on can be reduced to one conclusion. Disease detection is an outcome of system design. A healthier baseline, supported local workforce, accessible technical advice, capability to act, trusted relationships, and reciprocal value all influence what becomes visible. Rather than asking how to get communities to participate in surveillance, we should ask what the system must build and sustain so that locally grounded detection is feasible, useful, and connected within the response. None of these components guarantees detection by itself, of course. Their value comes from operating together. A trained worker needs a reporting pathway. A pathway needs an accessible service. A service needs community trust and access. And the relationship is strengthened when responding creates meaningful local value. And so the principle that AMRRIC uses to bring these ideas together is no survey without service. It's not something that we claim to have coined. It's a familiar catch cry, but it's certainly one that we truly believe in. At its simplest, this means that when communities contribute their knowledge, time, relationships, and access to support surveillance, the activity should also create immediate and tangible value locally. In AMRRIC's Biosecurity pilot project, that meant that animal health data was collected alongside broad-spectrum antiparasite treatments, animal first aid, veterinary advice, education, and locally useful information provision. But the principle is broader than any particular service. It doesn't mean that every surveillance activity must become a comprehensive vet program, or that communities should participate only in exchange for a benefit. It means that surveillance objective and the local value proposition should be designed together. Not that community benefits should be considered later, once the information needs of an agency have already been determined. The appropriate value will differ between communities and sectors. It might include responding to an immediate priority, strengthening a local service, supporting paid roles, building useful capability, returning information in an accessible form, or ensuring that reporting leads to timely investigation and follow through. The important point is that value cannot be defined solely by the external organisation. It must be negotiated with the people whose participation the activity relies upon. Reciprocity cannot be added only at the point of engagement. It needs to shape the whole program, define priorities and benefits together, deliver through useful services and properly resourced local roles, use information responsibly through consent, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protections, Indigenous data governance and local access, and return findings, respond to concerns and follow through. Shared value is therefore a program design responsibility, not simply an engagement technique. Responsible information use is particularly important in Indigenous contexts. Animal household and location data all intersect with community knowledge and cultural responsibilities. Informed consent, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, and Indigenous data sovereignty should therefore shape what is collected, who can access it, how it's interpreted, and what is returned. The service component of no survey without service should not be understood simply as an incentive offered in return for information. Improving animal health creates value in its own right, and those benefits actually ripple across the community. Healthier animals means fewer preventable diseases and parasites, reduced risks of zoonotic transmission and dog bites, improved animal health and welfare, stronger relationships between people and their animals. Well-managed animal populations can also contribute to safer public places, community amenity, protection of native wildlife, and stronger connections between the health of animals, country, people, and culture. These outcomes matter locally, but they also strengthen biosecurity. When everyday animal health improves, unusual illness is easier to recognise. When communities experience animal health activities as useful and respectful, participation and trust can grow. When local workers receive practical experience, tools and supported roles, the capability to notice and escalate concerns becomes stronger. Community benefit and biosecurity benefit are therefore not competing outcomes. Well-designed activities can produce both and can each reinforce each other. This wider value is also one reason that a narrow cost comparison can be misleading. Expenditure on treatment, local employment, or return information might be classified as separate from a surveillance system, even though it produces the conditions through which surveillance succeeds and generates benefits across several policy areas. So AMRRIC's Biosecurity pilot project applied the principle of no survey without service across remote Northern Australia between 2022 and 24, thanks to a grant from the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries and Forestry. The project began with local partnerships. AMRRIC worked with Indigenous ranger groups, local government, environmental health organisations, and other community-based partners, rather than treating communities simply as locations for data collection. Partners received practical, contextually appropriate training in companion animal health, biosecurity surveillance, and use of the AMRRIC app as a data collection tool. Fee-for-service arrangements were incorporated so that local coordination and participation could support Indigenous employment. Community-wide companion animal censuses were then undertaken with informed household consent. Every animal observed was offered broad-spectrum antiparasitic treatments. Veterinary or veterinary nurse support was available to provide advice, respond to animal health concerns, and deliver first aid where required. The census captured population, animal health, and syndromic surveillance information, but it also responded to an immediate and visible community priority: improving the health of dogs and cats. Aggregated reports were returned to participating organisations to support their own animal management planning. The information could also contribute to wider biosecurity understanding and provide pathways for priority concerns to be reported. So the surveillance information was not collected through a separate extractive exercise. It instead generated local partnerships, supported capability, and an animal health activity which was intended to be useful to the community. The model was also deliberately flexible. Different partner types brought different strengths, and activities were adapted to suit different community circumstances. The consistent elements, though, were consent, tangible animal health benefit, practical learning, resourcing for local participation, and information that could be useful both locally and to the wider system. Over 3 years, the project delivered 41 community-wide companion animal surveillance events across 25 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Almost 8,000 animals were observed, generating substantial population and animal health information. And importantly, more than 7,300 dogs and cats also received broad-spectrum antiparasitic treatments. The project trained 126 people and generated 328 days of Indigenous employment through paid community partner engagement. 84, almost 85% of funded community partner organisations were Indigenous controlled, helping direct investment through organisations already holding local responsibilities, knowledge and relationships. And when we examine the overall project expenditure, 65.6% created an immediate and direct community benefit. This included animal health treatment and first aid supplies, local partner payments, education resources, veterinary and vet nurse support, and the travel required to deliver those services. These results matter because they show that expenditure on community value was not peripheral to surveillance model. It was the mechanism through which the project generated its reach, participation, and information. The project didn't have to choose between useful biosecurity information and tangible local benefit. By designing them together, it was able to deliver both. These comments help explain why the model worked. When partners were asked which benefit of participating was most valuable to their organisations, the majority identified improvements in animal health as the most beneficial benefit. The next most frequently identified benefit was increased local knowledge and capability. That matters because it shows that the service component was not simply an incentive to a surveillance project. Healthier animals were the benefit that partners valued the most. Partners also valued meaningful paid work, increased skills and positive responses from the communities themselves. As one partner observed, when people could see tangible improvements in their animals' health, this helped to build trust and active participation in biosecurity activities. Service, capability and surveillance were therefore mutually reinforcing. Of our 8 responding community partners surveyed in our evaluation, those 8 partners all agreed that surveillance had improved throughout the project. 4 had experience of both the AMRRIC model and NABS's fee-for-service surveillance activities. And across 14 assessed outcomes, they rated AMRRIC's approach more strongly on 8, the models equal on 5, and NABS more strongly for increased economic opportunity and meaningful employment. Now that NABS strength is important. Sustained paid engagement through ranger groups is certainly something to retain, but also something that can potentially be built upon. 6 of the 8 partners said that their teams had developed skills to undertake census-based surveillance activities independently. Continuation, though, was constrained by funding for parasite treatments. Capability and willingness remained, but the resource that sustained the local value proposition unfortunately did not. So if service makes participation useful and effective, its ongoing cost is part of surveillance infrastructure, not an optional extra. Now, of course, these were small, relatively small respondent numbers and shouldn't be interpreted as definitive program comparisons. However, the findings were consistent across qualitative feedback and quantitative ratings. They point toward a combined opportunity. Retain the strong employment mechanisms associated with NABS's model while incorporating service-linked surveillance and a more explicit local value proposition. The Biosecurity Pilot Project provides one example of no survey without service, but the aim isn't for other programs to simply copy and paste AMRRIC's census and treatment model. The practical form of reciprocity will depend on the community, the sector, the biosecurity risk, and the purpose of the activity. I feel like a useful starting point is to ask whose priorities have shaped the work. Has the problem and the proposed activity been negotiated with the people involved? Or has engagement only begun after the agency has determined what it needs? We should then identify whose contributions the activity relies upon. That includes not only formal data collection, but also local knowledge, coordination, introductions, trust, access, interpretation, and follow-up. We need to ask whether those contributions are recognised and appropriately resourced. The next question is what immediate value participation creates locally. In AMRRIC's project, that included parasite treatment, first aid, veterinary advice, training, paid work, and returned information. Elsewhere, the appropriate value may be completely different and should be defined by the community. We also need to examine what happens when somebody reports a concern. Is there an accessible contact? Can the concern be investigated? Will the person or community hear what happened? A reporting system without a credible response pathway may weaken rather than strengthen future responses. Finally, what remains after the activity ends? That might include skills, paid roles, equipment, accessible data, stronger relationships, clearer reporting pathways, or an ongoing service connection. So these questions shift engagement from being a method of securing participation to being part of how the program's purpose, resources, and benefits are designed. No survey without service will therefore look different in different settings. The constant is that community value must be considered as deliberate within the service objective. I began by asking what value our programs are prepared to create within communities when their knowledge and participation are valuable to us. AMRRIC's Biosecurity Pilot Project doesn't provide a universal model, but it does demonstrate what becomes possible when community benefit and surveillance are designed together cohesively. Effective disease detection depends on more than reporting tools or community awareness. It depends on the everyday animal health baseline, accessible services, supported local capability, trusted relationships, and a credible pathway from observation to response. These conditions require investment. They cannot be assumed to exist, and they should not depend upon unrecognised or unpaid local labour. No survey without service asks us to treat community value as part of the program's core design, not as an engagement incentive or an additional benefit considered after the surveillance objectives have been established. The form of that value will differ between communities and between sectors. The responsibility is to define it together, resource it appropriately, handle knowledge and information responsibly, follow through when concerns are raised, and leave something useful behind. If we can do that, we can build biosecurity systems that are not only more equitable and respectful, but also more capable of seeing, understanding, and responding to emerging risks. Because what the system sees depends on what it supports. And effective participation is strongest when value travels both ways. Thanks very much for listening to my monologue, and I would be very eager to hear any thoughts or questions that have arisen as a result.
Fantastic, Bonnie. Thank you so much for your time. What an amazing presentation. What an amazing piece of work you've done. I love hearing about relationships adding value. It's obviously one of my big things as well, so it's really great to hear. I'm inviting people at this point, as Bonnie has, to put up your hand and ask a question or to put something in the chat, and I'm happy to read it out to Bonnie as well if you're a little bit shy. So I see that Mike has his hand up. Mike, I'd love to hear from you.
I don't need to go first, Chair. This is a really ignorant question. So if anyone's got a more intelligent one, they should go first.
I'm sure it's fabulous, Mike. I'm not even going to buy into that.
Look, it's probably implied in the presentation, Bonnie, and I just haven't picked up on it. But if you are you able to sort of say, if you break your work out into chunks that's being delivered, I imagine there's a fair bit of dog health going on because there's a lot of photos there of that. But are you able to sort of give us a little bit of texture in terms of what's taking up your time in terms of chunks of work or chunks of money or
Yeah,
what the
sure.
structure of it is? It's other
Yeah.
people probably know, but I don't. Sorry.
No, that's very valid. So AMRRIC as an organisation broadly, we deliver a lot of veterinary services that are population management focused, and so that's predominantly focused on dogs and cats, companion animals in remote communities, so owned animals, often free roaming, but owned nonetheless. So we do a lot of desexing, we do a lot of zoonotic disease prevention through antiparasitics, we deal with animal welfare concerns as they present. And so really that's the foundation and why we were able to deliver this program as well. The relationships and the longevity of those relationships that we had established over the many years of delivering those veterinary services meant that we knew what our community partners were asking for, which is always more and more animal health service. Most communities are receiving maybe 1 or 2 weeks of vet visits per year. And that's typically insufficient for the scale of the need. So designing ways to increase services was something that we were hearing consistently from communities. And then, of course, we had the experience of eCanis, which happened to coincide with COVID lockdowns and all sorts of broader complications at that time period as well. And that really highlighted to us that improving that health baseline was so critical for biosecurity issues to be able to be detected in companion animals in remote communities where access to animal health is so limited. And so we were really, really thrilled to be awarded this grant, which ran from 2022 to 24, which was, really focused on biosecurity in companion animals and doing those door-to-door censuses. This grant, I think the total grant was around $1.5 million over those 3 years. And that allowed us to physically go and deliver the training, to provide our partners with fee-for-service arrangements to be able to support their participation, the antiparasitics, obviously to help with the animal health. It really was the value add of AMRRIC's existing relationships really meant that it became more and more possible. I think it would have been a difficult project to deliver had we not had those established relationships through the delivery of our existing services. Does that answer the question, Mike? I feel like it's...
Yeah. So like I'm getting a vision here of you reach out, you get the permission to go out to the community, you sort of collect up what animals you can, you treat them for anti-parasite sort of treatments, and then I guess you desex them on a needs by needs, case by case basis.
All with owner consent and local partnerships mixed into that as well. Yeah.
And then from that you draw blood, I guess, and you can send some of that away, can you?
Yeah, if the animal is showing a sign of something that warrants further investigation, we can absolutely do that. The challenge with companion animals is that most of the diseases that are going to be experienced in companion animals are not notifiable. So there's not sort of national or state level support for the diagnostics on a lot of that. And so a lot of it is just the clinical observation because the remote community owner often doesn't have the finances to be able to pay for further diagnostics anyway.
Some diagnostics are done, and then I'm guessing they're mapped, are they? So you can draw a bit of a map about where you're finding various problems, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. So, based on our syndromic surveillance, or if there is a particular concern that we would sample, then we can alert that through to the relevant state or national authorities, depending on what the case may be.
And would you, so one more question, Chair, apologies I'm taking up everybody's time here, but I'm guessing that some of that data then would shed light on like the type of incursion and the nature of the incursion and where the incursions come in. Is the data that granular, or do we just know we've got something and it's around about here somewhere?
Yeah, often it's the latter, unfortunately. And to be fair, we only really have in terms of incursion events, the eCanis experience is the only recent experience in companion animals anyway. We haven't, fortunately, touch wood, had, rabies or any other sort of significant emergency animal disease events coming in affecting companion animal populations, and particularly not those in the north. The eCanis event certainly highlighted that our ability to detect it without actively looking for it was not great. It was widespread before it was formally detected. It was detected first in the Kununurra area, but in the subsequent months of dedicated sampling to determine its distribution, it was all over the NT. It was pretty much right through northern WA, and in the years following, it's emerged in far north Queensland as well. So it was definitely an issue of concern in that, that disease had evidently become quite established and widespread before it was really picked up. And, there are factors that are contributing to that. It's got vague and non-specific signs often. It's similar to a lot of the signs of diseases that were already present and endemic in northern communities in Australia. There was nothing that made you go, oh, it must be such and such. But, also then the systemic factors contributed to that, to the nature of the time between when it first came into Australia and when it was detected and surveilled across the regions where it had established.
Well, thank you, Bonny, and thank you, Chair. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Fabulous. Thanks, Mark. I see Trevor's got his hand up. Trevor.
Yes, Bonny here, Trevor Ranford. Thanks for that presentation. My area has been in the plant sector for a good period of time. The challenge that I see so often is that we set these programs up based on government funding, and how your thoughts on how we turn it into a self-funding, self-reliant program. And I've seen it with fruit fly activities around the country where we develop this program and then government pulls its money and the community struggles to continue it on. So
Absolutely.
do you see a model that one can implement that might make it self-reliant?
Look, I think there's a few opportunities. I'm not saying that any of them are particularly easy, but one of them would be more co-investment across sectors. So in Queensland, for example, animal health activities in remote Indigenous communities are ultimately predominantly funded through a Queensland health program that is supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander environmental health. So through that public health program, they're looking at preventable public health issues like dog bites or zoonotic diseases, as well as broader environmental health things like water safety and waste management. So in Queensland, the Indigenous local governments are supported through that Queensland health funding, and that allows them to deliver some animal health activities. It's not sufficient, again, to meet the needs of those communities, but it helps to establish more of a baseline of good animal health and good animal management compared to what is available otherwise. So if DAF got together with Queensland Health or even Federal Health and co-designed some program policies, they could be each leveraging, I think, the contributions and potentially looking at the sum being greater than the parts. So I think more cross policy co-investment where possible in that sort of One Health sense would be really valuable. I think also what's really missing in the biosecurity sector, in the companion animal space in particular, is that we actually have a thriving industry in Australia. Pets are a booming business. There's lots of money in companion animals, but none of that has been channeled into our biosecurity structures or systems. So there is no companion animal peak body represented among the biosecurity stakeholders for animal health. There's all those livestock industry stakeholders, and in wildlife, we've got Wildlife Health Australia. but there's no stakeholder for companion animal health, and there's also no levy funding that's contributing into biosecurity. So I think there's some really big systems gaps that need to be addressed as well. AMRRIC is a big advocate in this space, but we can't be that representative. We don't represent all of Australia's companion animals. But I think there is an important gap there that could be recognised, and through then the thriving business of pet ownership, there could be some levies put in place to help support biosecurity and companion animals.
Thank you. And, I suppose the potential I would see also is involving the industry aspects. And you talk about, if you're talking Northern Territory as a major area in Queensland, the big industry is obviously the cattle industry and the sheep industry. Maybe involvement with their programs and their funding may assist, because there is a relationship with dogs on cattle farms and those sorts of things. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trevor. I have a question, Bonny. Sure. A lot of what you talked about today is obviously about having existing relationships with communities, and I'm sure that there's people on the line here today that probably don't have those relationships, and I'm just wondering what you would recommend in terms of a starting point, because obviously this is something that AMRRIC's been doing for some time. You've got those existing relationships. How would you recommend that people that are here today kind of start that? Because I think, people are here because they recognise that there might be a gap, or that's something that they recognise that they need to do, but what do they need to actually do to make that happen?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, if you're looking to establish relationships, to reflect on the purpose and determine if that purpose is one-sided or if there's genuine reciprocity in the intent of that engagement. If it truly is just a one-sided purpose, then perhaps rather than trying to establish your own relationships for your own organisation or agency, you're better off to leverage and partner with organisations that are on ground, that are delivering services, that do have established relationships, and work in partnership and collaboration in that way, rather than trying to establish relationships for a very limited purpose. I think there's lots of stories from remote communities where they see so many faces coming in and out of community, all wanting something or some other contribution, without there being much genuine value in offer in return. So I think it's really important to be cognizant of that whenever we're working with communities, whether they be remote communities or communities in general, that we should really attempt to support existing relationships and leverage those where possible. But if that's not a possibility, then I think just genuinely being respectful, cultural humility, recognizing your own biases, all those sort of qualities in any sort of relationship management are essential. So I think anything that we can do to improve our emotional intelligence and relationships with people will benefit those intents as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bonny. Now, I'm aware of time, and I do want to take this opportunity to thank Bonny so much for joining us today. I know this is an area that people are really interested in, particularly, I guess, engagement with remote communities, but generally community engagement as well. So it's really fantastic to see so many join us, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Bonny for a really fabulous presentation today, and really starting to get us to think differently about how we might engage in the future. So thank you so much again, Bonny. And thank you to everyone who has, no worries, thank you. And thank you to everyone who has joined online. I know it's an hour out of your day, and for busy people, that's a lot. So I do really appreciate you taking the time to learn and listen, and I guess build your own relationships and your own thinking about how we can do things differently within the biosecurity sector. So thank you. It's been really fabulous to see so many of you today. As I mentioned earlier, there is a survey that Chantel has popped into the chat. The link is just there. They're really short surveys, these. So if you can take a moment out of your day just to fill that out for us, we would obviously be very grateful to you. And I will look forward to seeing you on the line for our next event. So thank you so much, and have a fabulous rest of the day.
Thanks so
much, you very much. Bye.